Hey everyone, it's me, Mishalla. I know you guys were expecting Mishalla and our awesome friend Claire from the UK. Unfortunately, today she fell ill and can't join me, so you're stuck with just me and some other friends. Don't worry, as we celebrate World Wildlife Day all together. I am seeing so many people from all around the world in the comment section, and everybody saying they are so stoked for this. We are also quite stoked for this. I see people from Portugal, Michigan, San Francisco. Maryland, Chicago. You guys are coming in from all over the world. We hope this time zone. Poland. Hello, Poland. We hope this time zone works out to where we can get a lot of you guys on here live with us. But don't worry, because if you can't watch this live and you're not watching this live right now, it's because this episode is being recorded and will live in perpetuity on our YouTube channel, OMSYSTEM.Cameras. So you can come back and watch this at a later date. Oh, we've even got the Australians from down under in here. Hello, Australia. Thank you for joining us this morning, night. I don't know what time it is there. Somebody in the chat tell me what time it is in Australia. Ooh, and Greece. Hello. All right. So as you know, today's World Wildlife Day. That's what we're talking about today. All things wildlife, little furry animals, all of our friends out in the wilderness. And we have two really awesome OM System ambassadors that are quite talented at wildlife photography. So we thought we would get them together today and have a nice conversation and take a look at some of their photos and some of how they have evolved their photography skills through the years. So we should probably just introduce Brooke, Bartleson, and Art Lefo. Hey guys.
Hey, how's it going?
How are you guys doing this morning? Is it like afternoon where you guys are, right?
As of 3 minutes ago, it's the afternoon.
Yes. I'm not very good at time zones, as the comment section is well aware of.
Me neither. Yeah, super excited to be here. It's like Mishalla said, it's World Wildlife Day. Arthur and I are the world's biggest wildlife nerds. And today's a really special day, not only in terms of the fact that this is a designated established holiday, World Wildlife Day, but I wanted to announce like a pretty cool, exciting piece of bear information. It's the 3rd day of March. March is a really big month in the life cycle of wild bears, black bears, and grizzly bears, brown bears, because they're coming out of hibernation like any day now. So if you live in a place that has bears, it's officially the month where you should keep an eye out for them. World Wildlife Day is always like the first big animal themed holiday of the month. And it's like the little indicator to me, oh, it's World Wildlife Day. Time to start carrying my bear spray with me when I go hiking again. So yeah, exciting stuff.
Awesome. I'm just going to adjust some mic settings. We're getting some feedback about audio. So I see you guys in the comments. Tell me when things aren't going right. I need your support because I don't know what I don't know. All right. So let's go through a real brief introduction for anyone who's new in the OM System world, and maybe you're not familiar with our ambassador program. Brooke and Art are both OM System ambassadors. Let's kick it off with Brooke first. Let's talk about you and your background just a tiny bit before we get rolling into your photos.
Okay, yeah, so I'm Brooke. I am a wildlife photographer, primarily based in, kind of describe myself as the neo-Arctic wildlife habitats. So in the wintertime, I spend the coldest months of the year somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, kind of a different location every season. I go from Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, are kind of the states that I roam through the winter months. And then in the summertime, I'm up in Alaska, where I pick up my second job, which is as a bear viewing guide with Arthur. Lead people out to go see bears in the wild. Absolutely really lucky to live such a diverse lifestyle of locations. And the reason why I do that is because of my primary subjects for photography, which is obviously wildlife. I focus primarily on megafauna. So large animals. I don't have a ton of experience photographing birds or doing any sort of, forest floor critters in the macro realm of photography. I'm definitely focusing on larger animals. Bears are my specialty, obviously, because I work as a bear guide. I prioritize spending time with bears over other wildlife. I focus on wildlife of North America. I've spent some time working with Olympus in Botswana before. It was absolutely magical and amazing. But my expertise is definitely in the wildlife of North America. So that's what my specialty is. And I love the question, why wildlife photography?
Right.
I have a million bajillion answers to that question, but since it's World Wildlife Day, I think I'll kind of just focus on, I think the one that most people can relate to. As human beings, we are like biologically designed to love animals. From the day we're born as little kids, we have stuffed animals from the cradle. We're playing with different types of little animal figurines and toys and stuff like that. And I guess I'm the type of person who just never outgrew that childish love and obsession for animals. So I've also learned that because that love tends to be latent within every single human being on Earth in some capacity, wildlife photography is a really cool way to connect with folks that I might not have anything else in common with otherwise. Everyone's going to look at a photo of an animal and feel something. They're going to feel impressed or intimidated or curious. They're going to look at the bear or whatever the subject is and be like, gosh, that's so cute. So it's just a really cool form of communication between myself and people that I might not be able to reach otherwise. And typically the main thing I'm trying to communicate through my photos is, look at this cool animal. Let's try to protect and preserve them. And that's what World Wildlife Day is all about. So that's why I'm super excited for the rest of this conversation today. But that's enough about me. I'll let Arthur go ahead now and introduce himself. And also this wolf picture is like the greatest photo in existence.
So. It really is.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having us, Mishalla. Hi again, Brooke. It's been a little bit since I've seen you, but I probably won't see you in too long. For those who don't know, Brooke and I, we shoot a lot. My name is Arthur. Obviously, what do I shoot? I shoot OM System, formerly Olympus, and I shoot wildlife.
Photograph wildlife.
Yes, photograph. If I ever use the word shoot on this live stream, please let it be known it's photograph. So I photograph wildlife. I photograph megafauna across North America, across the world, but really much like Brooke, focused on high latitude regions, neo-Arctic regions. Large, usually top of the food chain animals are really what makes my soul vibrate, so to say. So I live my year bears in the summer, much like Brooke, as she mentioned. Her and I are co-bear guides in Alaska in the summer months. And in the winters, when the bears goes to sleep, I focus on other animals, particularly wolves, as you see in this image here. However, wolves can be kind of hard to find for those of you who don't know. They're kind of elusive animals. So I'm very happy to spend my time with a bunch of other animals: moose, foxes, coyotes, owls, eagles, you name it. If they're wild and they live in the wild, I love them, as does Brooke. Where do I shoot? Again, focusing most of my time kind of depends on the time of year. In the summers, I spend a lot of time in Alaska. In the winters, a lot of time mostly in Wyoming. I homestead here in Denver, Colorado for the time being, but I travel a lot, so I'm always out and about, whether it's New Mexico, Utah, Montana, Wyoming, always traveling. So kind of hard to answer where do I shoot, because it's a little bit all over the place sometimes. And why? Much like Brooke said, this is one of my favorite questions. Maybe less of a bubbly answer from my end than Brooke's childhood stuffed animal answer, but I love that one. For me, it's really coming from a similar place, but more focused on where we stand today as a society, and what World Wildlife Day means to me is really coming back to our senses as humans as to where we come from, which is wilderness and nature, and reconnecting with the animals and the nature that we once came from. That's kind of also my life goal and career goal, is to help and inspire people to reconnect with wilderness, to develop their own personal connection to wilderness, to wild animals, and to continue spreading that passion and that love for all things wild, to help protect them at the end of the day, for the conservation of the wildlife and the wild spaces that we love. Really excited about this talk. I think Brooke and I have a few exciting things to share with you guys all. So let's get to it.
Yeah. I love that you guys live the most nomadic lifestyle on the planet. And that kind of leads us to where you guys are going this summer together, right? It's summer. Am I invited, by the way? Do I get to come?
You're always invited.
Yes.
Please come. That would be so fun.
Oh, we could do a live stream from Alaska of me running from bears, because I'm really afraid of bears. Honestly, I should not come on this trip.
We'll try not to run.
But that's our specialty, is getting people who are afraid of bears to no longer be afraid of bears.
I did learn when I was in Yosemite to yell "Hey bear" whenever I was around, so that they leave me alone. I'm letting them know.
That's a very good one. Yeah. Always announce your presence when you're in bear country so they know you're around. The only scary bear is a surprised bear. If the bear knows that you're around, they're going to, you know, be a little bit more respectful of you and your space.
Mhm.
So that kind of leads into like who Arthur and I are as a team. So we are co-guides, and that's not just with bear viewing. Our primary opportunities to guide together usually do focus on brown bears up in Alaska. So for the last few summers, we've been guiding out of Juneau, taking small float planes, like little tiny bush planes with floats on them. One of my clients once described it as a stick of gum with wings, because I mean, it was really tiny.
A stick of gum.
Flying out to the coast of the ABC Islands in the Alexander Archipelago, which is off the coast of Juneau, to take people out to view bears at ground level. We're viewing fully wild bears, primarily, exclusively actually in these trips, brown bears, which for those who don't know bear terminology, they're the same thing as grizzly bears. We just call them brown bears when they live within roughly 150 miles of the coastline. So if you go to Yellowstone or Grand Teton National Park or Denali National Park, you're technically inland. So the grizzly bears you see there would be called grizzly bears. If you're in Anchorage or, you know, the Kenai Peninsula up in Alaska or Juneau or any of the islands off the coast, you are close to the ocean. So just the terminology for those bears is brown bears. So that's Arthur and I's specialty together in guiding in the summertime. And then as of this winter, we are guiding together in Wyoming and Montana, leading wildlife viewing trips for all of the other types of wildlife that you see in the wintertime while the bears are hibernating. So obviously Arthur's the wolf guy, so there's a heavy emphasis on trying to see and experience wolves in the wild, whether we're viewing them or simply just tracking them and looking at their sign on the landscape. And then we spend time with, you know, the bison, the moose, the elk, the deer, foxes, coyotes, whatever other little critters choose to make themselves visible in the Rocky Mountain range this time of year. We are also really fortunate to, as you can tell, live really similar lifestyles of just like never ending adventurousness. So we've become the world's best adventure buddies. We're constantly getting into just ridiculous situations in our love for wildlife. We constantly are trying to push deeper and deeper into wild spaces, explore new terrain, experience things we haven't done before together, which is just a really nice dynamic to have, you know, to have a friend that can go out and shoot with you who's super passionate about the same things you are. And we are just like the ultimate animal lovers. If you were to sit with Arthur and I while we're, you know, grabbing a drink or sitting down and sharing a meal, we're probably never going to stop talking about animals, whether they're our dogs, Arthur's cat, or the actual wildlife that we're photographing, or if we're just arguing about different opinions regarding conservation or comparing notes about little ecology things that we've learned and tracking things we've experienced. We just are pretty much incapable of talking about anything else, which is why we don't have a lot of other friends, because people can't stand to try to keep up with these endless animal conversations.
I feel like that's not true. I feel like you have a posse of all your friends that go and travel to all these wild places. I always see you guys and I'm like, oh, look, Brooke has all her buddies together. Oh, Art has all his friends together.
We do have our little like team of fellow wildlife photographers. Birds of a feather definitely flock together in the wildlife industry. It's just, you know, it's hard to do this stuff alone.
Right.
There's the safety aspect of it. There's also just like, it can be really, really isolating. You know, you're out for hours in the wilderness, and it can be challenging to feel connected to the world in any way. So it is definitely really nice to find a little niche of human beings that are into wildlife photography. And I do see people in the comments, you know, like asking how they can find a community like that. We all found each other over social media. We didn't listen to the advice of our parents growing up, don't talk to strangers online. We started talking online, and it's totally grown into this network of friends and co-guides and business partners and stuff like that, all revolving around a love of animals. Mm-hmm. What's really awesome about that is because we all share similar loves for wildlife, and we're all constantly in touch with one another, sharing ideas and relevant issues surrounding wildlife. It's also given us this really effective little network of ambassadors for the wild when relevant conservation issues come to light. So I don't know if you've been following Arthur, I, or any of other buddies that we shoot with, you'll see on Polar Bear Day, we were all sharing the same campaign, bringing attention to a project that Polar Bears International is working on right now to help use radar technology to locate bears in their dens. There's some relevant things going on right now in Utah regarding cougar conservation that we've all been speaking up about over the last couple of days. And it's just nice to all be in touch and be able to share those ideas back and forth and things like that.
So I do have a couple of questions that are popping up, and it's on this slide, guys, but maybe Art, you can talk a little bit about how people can get in and involved in your guides and what the website is. I know the website's on the slide here, but
yeah. For those, so I think that was Richard that asked that question. Richard, you can find us at thinkwildexp.com or on Instagram at thinkwildexp. This is kind of just a passion project that Brooke and I and a few other friends started because we wanted to bring people into the wilderness our way, which is a very friendly and approachable way. And over our first few trips here, everyone that left made a bunch of new friends, new wildlife warriors, people who are just as stoked on wildlife as we all are. So if you're looking to make friends, that's a great way to start. But other than that, I really like what Brooke was saying. Like, reach out via Instagram, talk to strangers, even though your parents told you not to. That's how Brooke and I met. Our friendship was born in the wild. We actually met in front of a small black bear, recently weaned black bear cub that was feeding in the berries of Grand Teton National Park. And that same day, we went onwards to Yellowstone and had both of our first experience with a great gray owl. Wildlife and wilderness unites us all, as cheesy as that might sound, but that's really how some of the best relationships and friendships in my life have come about. And so I'd like to encourage everyone, if you love animals, to reach out to people who do too, because you're guaranteed to find some great connections.
It's really awesome. And shout out to our team. Jen is working diligently in the comment section, and she just posted the link for their wildlife experiences. If you're following on YouTube, sorry, she posted it on our YouTube channel. For the Facebook people, head over to YouTube and watch this later, and you can click the link, or you can go to the link on the screen to learn more about Brooke and Art's wildlife experiences. Thank you, Jen, for helping in the comments today. All right, I'm going to get in. Let's look at some of your awesome photos. Whose photos are these?
Let's go. We'll kind of go one at a time here through these images, starting from left to right. And for this presentation, just so you guys know what we're going to cover today, we're going to start out by just going through some of these photos, which are a couple of Arthur and I's recent favorites, and talk primarily about the story behind these images for this slide specifically. After this, we'll dive into some compositional techniques, because obviously, even this is World Wildlife Day, and we are talking pretty heavily about wildlife and experiences around animals. We obviously want everyone to walk away with some sort of, new skill or concept that they can apply to their photography, whether they're brand new wildlife photographers or super experienced folks who've been doing this, longer than we have. So to start things off, this first photo up here on the upper left-hand corner of the two polar bears. It's just an image that I love for a couple of reasons. It's obviously an interesting composition, right? There's two polar bears. The cub is absolutely adorable. It seems to be a moment where there's quite a bit of tenderness captured between the two bears. But what I really like about this photo is when you think of polar bears, the classic polar bear image that comes to mind is probably the one where they're covered in blood, ripping over a seal carcass, the types of things that go viral and end up in publications left and right. But images of polar bears almost exclusively tend to include backdrops of snow and ice. And as recently as the first time I traveled up to Churchill, Manitoba to view polar bears in the wild, which is about 4 years ago now, I believe, maybe 4 or 5. Drew Hamilton, if you're listening, fact check me on that. But it was about half a decade ago. When I first traveled to Manitoba during this autumn timeframe of year, I did get those classic quintessential bear in the snow photos. But what we've seen as the climate is shifting, especially in the North Country, where we're seeing it at a much faster rate than down here in the lower 48, is those winter seasons seem to be hitting later and later every single year. And it's like the snow is coming a week, 2 weeks onwards later than anticipated. So this location where this photo was shot, Churchill, Manitoba, is called the polar bear capital of the world because in the fall, around Halloween, polar bears congregate there in tremendous numbers. The reason why all these polar bears are traveling from all these other locations on the tundra to specifically Churchill is because it's right at the southern shores of Hudson Bay, where the ice freezes first once temperatures get cold enough. Bears want to be on the ice, as we all know. They eat a lot of seals. In order to get to the seals, they have to be on the ice. So ice forms first at the southern tip of Hudson Bay at Churchill, and then it forms further up north and allows those polar bears to access their food source. And while the polar bears are waiting for that ice to freeze, they're on a landscape with no snow. And it's just, I like to say that I think the image of polar bears are changing. We're seeing a lot more photos and content of them in a habitat that we've never really seen before. The image of a polar bear with a blood-stained face is starting to be replaced by the image of a polar bear with a blueberry-stained face, because they're spending more time now on land having to supplement their food sources with things that aren't necessarily as natural a part of their diet. Blueberries is one of those major food sources that they're getting into up north. So that's why that's one of those photos that I love to use. It just tells a lot of a little bit of a story about polar bears and what they're up against right now. On a less sad note, this next photo to the right is also one of mine. This is a photo of a bald eagle. Bald eagles, I definitely think, are a conservation success story. Their symbol as the national bird of the United States has landed them a protected status for over a century now. It's illegal to kill bald eagles. If you do, accidentally kill a bald eagle, it flies into your window or you collide with it in a vehicle strike, you are required by law to report the eagle death, blah, blah, blah. And it's just, we have a really thriving eagle population in the lower 48 right now, even though there are some factors occurring environmentally that kind of put them up against the odds. We have a serious outbreak of avian flu right now that is affecting populations and probably will affect populations significantly more in the days to come. But, it's a little bit easier to maintain faith in these amazing animals sticking around because of the fact that they are federally protected. It's just kind of a cool example of what protections can do for an animal in their populations. I also just love this shot because it was a really cool opportunity to apply one of my favorite compositional techniques, which is getting eye level with your subject. It's really rare to be able to get eye level with a bird. This was an opportunity when Arthur and I were out shooting together up in the Canadian Rockies this past spring, fall. I don't know what seasons are or what time is.
Winter. It felt like winter.
I think it was spring. And yeah, the eagle perched on a perch that happened to be eye level with us. So we got to get some really unique shots of that moment.
Awesome. Next one over from the eagle to the right. That is a grizzly or a coastal brown bear in this case. That Brooke and I last summer got to know pretty intimately. This is a bear that I actually named. This is a bear named Silvertip. She had a pair of adorable cubs last year. And I really wanted to include a picture of a grizzly here because I think from a historical perspective, there's a really interesting story to the grizzly bear. For those of you who don't know, grizzlies used to roam as far east as the Mississippi River in the lower 48, which is amazing to think about when you think about where grizzlies live today in the lower 48, which is pretty much restricted to Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, maybe with a few scattering here and there a little bit further west. But nonetheless, they used to really roam across the great majority of the country. And of course, those numbers have been drastically reduced in the late 1800s and early 1900s with a lot of these culling and mass killing movements that happened towards predators, especially grizzly bears and wolves, which we'll talk about later. An interesting perspective in this photo is that this bear was photographed in Southeast Alaska, as I said, on the shores of Southeast Alaska, where the grizzly bears of the Southeast really rely on a variety of foods, but particularly salmon, as many of you might know, which of course is changing a lot as our oceans change, as our oceans warm. Salmon runs have become smaller and smaller over the years. And so bears have had to be a little bit more resourceful as that's changed. We've fought recently successfully, thanks to, shout out to Drew Hamilton if he's listening again, for the huge success and all the work we did to stop the Pebble Mine, which is officially stopped. For those of you who don't know, the Pebble Mine was a huge proposed mining project that was potentially going to completely ruin the Bristol Bay watershed, effectively poisoning the water with heavy metals and stuff like that, that would have killed salmon, the world's largest salmon fishery, and of course, all the animals that rely on them, aka bears, and the plants and vegetation and ecosystems around them. So that's a huge conservation success story. And to kind of cap off another interesting fact about how our our wild lands and our nature has changed, especially in the last 150 years. If you really look at it, it's really a short span that so much has changed in. This bear is photographed on Chichagof Island. Chichagof and Admiralty Islands both have one of the highest densities of brown bear populations in the world. To put that in perspective, on Admiralty Island, you've got about 1,500 brown bears for an island that's roughly 1,500 square miles. So you're talking about a bear per square mile. Let's put that in perspective with Yellowstone, which is 3,500 square miles. So more than double the size of this island. And Yellowstone has a bear population of approximately 300 bears, if I'm not mistaken. And there's about 1,500 grizzly bears in all of the lower 48 versus 1,500 brown bears on this one island. So that's kind of what nature and ecosystems are capable of sustaining and providing versus what we've done to them here with our continued infringement on the natural world as a human species. So I love that photo because there's so much to tell from it. The next one over to the right, speaking of Yellowstone, speaking of changing winters, actually it's been a very strong winter here in the Rocky Mountains. The coldest one in 10 years here in Denver, which is a really welcomed sight. And this photo was taken on our first Think Wild expedition last January in the northern range of Yellowstone. And this is just kind of one of those photos that I love because it shows the resilience of an animal that, even though in recent times they haven't struggled as much from a conservation perspective because bison are now introduced in many wild areas around the country, bison were nonetheless, much like bears, mostly exterminated from the lower 48 before they found a few strongholds in national parks and other protected lands. So really incredibly resilient animals, and to see them in the winter like this, oh my God, it's one of the coolest experiences. Brooke a few weeks ago was just completely nerding out about bison, like nonstop. She couldn't stop talking about bison. I was like, do you even like bears anymore?
I was looking at the bison and I was crying because it is just, there's something so magically impressive about seeing an animal like that trudge through conditions that would have me worn thin on the brink of death in a matter of hours. And they have no choice but to keep going perpetually forever. Like by the time I'm at home, wrapped up in a blanket, watching Netflix, that bison is still out there trudging through the snow. It's just a wild thought. I'm going to cry again.
I guess we'll move down to the bottom left, which is also my photo. That's a black wolf, which for those of you who don't know is actually just a gray wolf, all the same species, gray wolf, Canis lupus, that was photographed in Grand Teton National Park in January of 2021. So less recent picture, but nonetheless very relevant on a day like today. What I love about this image, which I titled Understand Fear, is the soft and almost, there's a gaze in this wolf's eye that makes you want to, I hesitate to use the word befriend, but get to understand it or know it. Right? There's no aggressiveness, there's no maliciousness in those eyes. It's a very tender and soft gaze, which is very much what it felt like in the moment when I was 5 yards away from this wolf in deep snow. Never felt any sort of aggression, just curiosity and a striking level of intelligence. But all that to say that wolves are facing many challenges on the conservation side too these days. In Montana and Idaho and Wyoming, there are several, depending on the state, rather reckless wolf hunts going on that have drastically reduced their population numbers year over year. So a lot of conservation work happening on that front too. Love this image. This is one of my most special top 3, I'd say, wildlife experiences in my life. And I hope you enjoy it too. Brooke?
So this next photo is this little juvenile bobcat that Arthur and I also photographed together in Yellowstone last winter, around this time of year, actually. And so bobcats are actually an animal that has a really positive story around them right now. Bobcats, coyotes, foxes, great horned owls, ravens. There's a slew of types of animals that one of their adaptations that they've really successfully been able to capitalize on in recent years is they tend to actually thrive in areas where there's been a lot of human development. So it sounds a little bit counterintuitive that as humans develop and expand into formerly wild spaces, it sounds counterintuitive that that would ever be beneficial for an animal. But it is important to point out that for some species, specifically bobcats, that is the case. They eat a lot of rodents. Humans bring rodents. They are animals that really thrive in habitats where larger competitors are frightened to spend time. So wolves and bobcats, they sometimes have a little bit of an adversarial relationship because the wolves are chasing away or prioritizing feeding on foods that bobcats also try to get a hold of. Makes it a little bit harder for them to survive. Similarly, bobcats and mountain lions can have similar forms of competition. But those larger carnivores tend to be a little bit more uncomfortable around humans and their spaces, which has enabled the bobcat to really fill that niche. So as we're pushing larger wildlife out, these smaller species are taking advantage of that. So as a result, it's actually a lot more common in this modern era to see a bobcat in the suburbs than it is in the pure wilderness. There are a few locations where I've had friends travel and successfully photograph abundances of bobcats, and they tend to be like recently built neighborhoods in the suburbs of Denver or outside of Phoenix and things like that, or really populated neighborhoods down in Florida, things like that. So what was really unique about this experience of finding this bobcat was Arthur and I and our two friends were actually in an extremely remote wilderness area, where as far as we knew, there wasn't, and maybe still isn't, an established population of bobcats. They are excessively rare in the place where we saw this cat. We don't really understand the story as to what she was doing there, if she was passing through. Like I said, she's a juvenile bobcat, so she was probably recently weaned and kicked out by her mom. I also have a tendency to refer to this bobcat as a female. Very well could have been a male. We're not certain on what the bobcat is, but it is a little bit relevant to explaining why they might have been in this area. If it's a young male, maybe it was recently dispersed from mom, it's looking for a territory where it can find a mate. Or if it's a young female, maybe there is an established population in this wilderness area, but it's just so remote that there haven't been any robust studies proving whether or not they're present. So this was just a really special moment. We spotted this bobcat popped out of the willows behind us. We were all like, that's a weird looking coyote, because our brains couldn't accept the fact that we were seeing a bobcat at this location. And then it became apparent, clear as day, that was not a coyote, it was a bobcat. We got to watch her disappear into the willows, see her camouflage really come into effect as she literally disappeared. And then we had this really special and unique moment where we just sat outside the willows patiently and quietly while she just kind of paced around a little bit, did bobcat things. And because she's a juvenile, she still has a lot of that curiosity, same way that we are. When we're young, we're learning about the world, you're exploring. You haven't yet learned to fear humans. Kat living in an area this remote maybe hasn't ever had an experience with humans before this. So she doesn't know that maybe we're not the same thing as her. She came out of the willows and she ended up pouncing right towards us. Like she was trying to initiate play with this group of humans. And it was just one of the most intimate and special encounters I've ever had with a wild animal. So I had to include that photo. It was also, I felt really lucky because it was me and Arthur and our two other friends, and we were all kind of in a line. So a lot of our photos from the encounter look the same because we were shooting shoulder to shoulder. But I'm a slowpoke. So when we were walking down to the willows, I was like the last in line. So I was far off to the right, while Arthur and our other two pals were sitting like right next to each other. So in the moment when the bobcat pounced, it came like a matter of feet from Arthur and our friends' lenses. So it was too close for them to get the photo of the pounce, but because I'm slow, I was further away and I got the pounce moment. So I've been rubbing these photos in their faces for a year and I don't ever plan to stop.
Never gonna live it down. Cool. Last one for me. Just another polar bear image, which, as Brooke said, changing times. This bear is actually feeding on blueberries right before I took this photo. You can't see it on its face, but I posted this because even though today's Wildlife Day, a few days ago was International Polar Bear Day, which is another wonderful animal we like to celebrate. So just wanted to shout out polar bears. We love you guys and love the work you're doing up there with Discover Churchill Drew.
I haven't seen Drew in the comments yet, and I'm not convinced he's watching. And so we need to have a talk with Drew after this.
Yeah.
He's in trouble.
He's in trouble.
Cool.
Dang it, Drew.
This last photo on the right is just one of my favorite photos ever. It's a bear that looks really cool. Arthur said everything there is to say about bears. We're really fortunate to get to work in an area in Alaska where we see what a thriving, stable population of bears can look like. And it gives me a lot of faith for further conservation models down in the lower 48 as their populations continue to grow and expand, how we can take a look at the example being set by Alaska to try to preserve them so that their numbers can continue to grow and we can continue to find solutions to live and work alongside them successfully. So without further ado, we can move into the part where we teach you guys stuff because we're really grateful that you're here and we want everyone to walk away with knowledge of camera-related things rather than just animal-related things.
No, I think you guys hit a lot of good points, and talking about conservation is a huge part of wildlife photography that I don't think that we focus on enough collectively as humans. So I think you guys did a great job kind of explaining all the different facets of that. And seriously, if you guys can't go on one of their excursions in the next year, you should at least follow along on their Instagram and view all their stories throughout the summer months and see the amazing amount of bears and trudging through lakes Brooke does and measuring scat. There's a lot of scat measuring, so it's not for the part, but you guys should definitely follow along on their stories to just see how magical it really truly is up there, and then join their excursions the following year.
So what we want to really dive into is showing you guys how our wildlife photography has progressed in all the years that we've gained experience. Wildlife photography is really hard. In my opinion, it's one of the most challenging genres in terms of things that you actually have control over. Because the reality is you have control over two things and two things only in wildlife photography. And that's your camera settings and your composition to some extent. Your settings obviously matter in wildlife photography. Conditions will never be what you want them to be. You don't get to add artificial lighting. You don't get to wait for the golden hour. Unfortunately, when the animal is visible and where they're visible, that's all you have to take opportunity to work with. So it's really important to understand how far you can push settings and things like that. And sometimes I tell people to throw the rules of settings completely out the window. We like to get told there's a rule of, don't shoot your ISO past this point. Don't drop your shutter speed this low. Do whatever you need to do settings-wise to get the shot. And what I think really matters most, I know Arthur agrees with this because we talk about this all the time with one another and with our clients for our workshops, is think so intentionally about the composition of your photo. I'll let Arthur talk about these two top photos because these are both his shots. I think his moose shot is one of the most iconic wildlife photos I've seen come out of the Grand Teton National Park area. So this is a great one for him to chat a little bit about.
Yeah, so kind of just showing the progression. The photo on the top left is also mine. That's a photo I took, just for context, a few months after buying my first Olympus camera, actually, back in 2018. So not too long ago, but this was a moose on the side of the road in Colorado where I was just stoked to see a moose, right? There, as lovers of the wild, we inherently have this excitement when we see a wild animal, right? And I think at first, when you get into wildlife photography, that excitement translates into, oh my God, I need to take a photo. And so you take a photo and you're like, I got a photo. Oh my God, yes. Which is great. But as you refine your skill and your craft and your artistic vision, I think you find more and more that you can actually take your time a little bit more once that initial awe and excitement wears off, and taking your time and sort of settling into the moment really leads to a lot of improvements. The photo on the right is a photo I took in November of 2020. Thank you, Brooke, for the kind compliments. But this is a photo that came about after a lot of planning and envisioning and kind of manifesting, so to say, and creating your own luck, which I think we all create our own luck when it comes to wildlife. So excited to kind of dive into some of the technical things of how I think you guys can improve your wildlife photos fairly quickly.
I do want to add a footnote. Arthur just said that photo, there was a lot of luck behind it. There wasn't that much luck behind this photo. This was Arthur investing an insane amount of time into the field and understanding moose behavior. When those moose were first visible to Arthur, they looked a lot like the photo of the moose on the left. They were bedded down, just chilling and relaxing. but he understood their behavior patterns and what trajectory these moose had been taking as they traveled across the sagebrush flats in this part of the national park. And he anticipated that if the moose eventually stood up, they were probably going to head for this location. And that's what enabled him to be at this location in the perfect timing to get the shot. So he likes to say it was luck, but it really wasn't. And that note applies a little bit to my little examples here down on the bottom. So both are photos of grizzly bears. The one on the left was also taken, I believe, in 2018. I took that in the Canadian Rockies. At the time, I didn't really have any understanding whatsoever at all of bear behavior. And so I saw this moment when a bear was visible to me, and I fired off all these shots of this bear scrounging around, you know, in the dirt. I had to do a lot of editing to make the bear stand out from the backdrop. You can kind of see behind the bear was some really thick willow and alder brush. Bears are biologically designed to camouflage into willow and alder brush. So they kind of become invisible up against that backdrop. And at the time, I didn't really think about the fact that, you know, my wild subjects, they move. They're not always going to stand in one place. And I spent a lot of time photographing this bear when it wasn't really in the most optimal location. Whereas if I'd been a little bit more mindful and patient and waited, it would have eventually moved into a spot where it was more charismatically photographable, which is the example of what happened on the right. Came across this bear in Alaska in kind of a little bit of a similar context. I love this photo, by the way. It's a really interesting Rorschach test to me. I don't know if that's the right word, but I love to see what emotions people assign to this bear. Some people say he looks really smiley and happy. Some people say he looks absolutely terrifying. I just think it's really cool to see how people interpret the bear's face differently. But yeah, this was a photo where I came across the bear. I believe he was bedded down when we first saw him. So he really blended into those tundra grasses. And with a little bit of patience, we just waited for him to stand up and start moving into a spot where he was more photographable. So let's dive in a little bit more and get really technical on compositional techniques here.
Somebody thinks that bear is smiling at you.
I
would agree.
Smiling and happy. My boyfriend thinks that it wanted to kill me. So I think it just, drop your comments, guys. I want to hear what the majority thinks on if this is a happy bear or a scary bear.
We're at like the 50-50 mark right now. Somebody thinks you're dinner. The other one thinks the bear's happy. So, all right.
Okay.
So whose image is this one?
This one is mine. And this is a compositional technique that I'm really excited to talk to you guys about because it was inspired by Arthur and his work. My mindset when I see an animal, and I think one of the things that draws me so much to wildlife photography is I'm obsessed with animals, and I love to see their faces. I love to see the parts of them that I can't see in real life. That means that my mind automatically, when I see an animal, I zoom in really close on their face. And sometimes I crop out what is actually the best part of the composition, which is their environment, their setting, or the tips of their antlers, or their physical body that shows their stature and power. As Arthur and I started shooting together a lot more over the last few years, I've seen that Arthur's style really tends to take in a lot of that backdrop and that habitat and environmental awareness of all of his photos and his subjects. So it changed my mindset quite a bit. And rather than always focusing on a super zoomed in composition, I pull out just a little bit. So the next two shots are kind of a comparison. So this is a moose photo from 2020 or 2019, I believe. I saw this bull moose. I was so excited because he had red looking eyes. He looked really tired and exhausted. So I zoomed in really close on his face. I do still think, I have to give myself some credit. I think it's still a really interesting photo. Like I said, you get to see details and aspects of a moose's face that you might not get to see in real life. But this next photo shows that you don't have to sacrifice that if you do zoom out a little bit. Now I have a photo of a bull moose where you can see just how big and impressive his antlers are, just how long his dewlap is. That's the funny name for that weird floppy thing. And the golden hues of his environment, the habitat behind him. And what's also really nice, if I do want to pull the classic Brooke thing where I zoom in a lot on a photo, I can just crop in. And I have both options. I have my close-up and I have my zoomed out. So if you're like me in wildlife photography and you just get really excited about an animal and want to zoom in on its face, that's fine and totally understandable, but just challenge yourself a little bit over your next few times out shooting to see how you can utilize the animal's backdrop to tell a little bit more of a story with your composition.
And to that note, just to add to it, if your tendency is to zoom out like me, then zoom in more, which is something that I've done since Brooke, whose nickname is also Close Crop Carl, I've been trying to zoom in more to try and get closer to my subjects and kind of get some of those compositions that Brooke is so masterfully puts out, and it's challenging, and it's fun to challenge yourself, and I think it leads to a lot of inspiration in this field that we can so often hit roadblocks on creatively. So yeah, great tip, Brooke. This is so then and now. A fox that I photographed in Grand Teton National Park. And so my tip for this image is create softness where it's needed. It's easy, as I said earlier, when you're taking photos of animals to just let yourself be completely overtaken by the joy and the exciting emotions of seeing a wild animal, and to just shoot away, right? And I think that slowing down and really settling into the present moment is one of my top 3 tips I give to every single person I ever shoot with. Oftentimes when you're shooting wildlife, as Brooke said, you're at the mercy of these animals. You can't tell an animal, hey, why don't you stand there a little bit further right? We're not working with humans here. The animals are doing what they want to do, and our goal as wildlife photographers should always be to intrude on them as little as possible and to alter their natural behavior as little as possible. So sometimes you need to work with your surroundings, right? And sometimes in the foreground or in the background, you can get pretty, noisy or busy environments if you have bushes or, like weird grass in the foreground or something. Or Brooke's photo in the last image, I think, was a great example of, how the background can just kind of blur things. So sometimes you need to create softness to bring attention to your subject where it's needed. So if we can go to the next slide, I can show you one of my first moose photos from shortly after I moved to Jackson Hole. This was in 2020, where, it's a moose. It's interesting as it is because it's a moose with one antler. And it kind of leads to the question, what happened to this moose? What's the story behind this moose? The background is soft-ish, but as a photographer, I'm always striving for smoother backdrops and sharper subjects. And the foreground, again, kind of busy with that sagebrush. For anyone who's ever photographed around sagebrush, you're probably aware that there's a big love-hate relationship with sagebrush in the photography community when it comes to wildlife, because it makes spotting animals in the summer very hard. And it's also very noisy and busy, and sometimes it can lend itself to a nice image, but a lot of the time I struggle with it. So in the now, this is an image in the same place at the same time of year. Both images were taken in November of a different moose, but nonetheless, very similar moment. But as you can tell right off the bat, far softer foreground, far softer background. And so my tip to you guys is get lower. Think about what you can use in the foreground or in the background to create that softness. And I guess in the simplest of terms, you can think of it this way. If you have your subject in the middle and you have you, the closer you are to your subject within reason, let me emphasize that, the closer you are to your subject and the further your background is, the softer your background will be, right? Same thing applies when it comes to foreground. So if I have, say, a bush that's very close to me in the foreground and I get low and that subject is pretty distant, because your camera is focusing in the distance, it's going to be a lot more blurry in the foreground. So if you use something close to blur the foreground, it helps give you that softness. And when it comes to the background, getting closer to your subject, again, with respect to your subject when it comes to wildlife, helps you create that softer backdrop. So really work with your positioning, get lower, get higher, play around with it, have some fun, see what you can use in your environment to create the softness when it's not there naturally.
I was going to say also, I would argue there's got to be some image compression going on, like different lenses being used potentially here, because you're also getting a different viewpoint. So, the benefit of those longer telephoto lenses allows you to step back further, zoom way in, compress that background, soften it up more, or foreground in this situation.
The first image was shot on the 40 to 150 f2.8 Pro. The second one is the 150 to 400 f4.5. So different lenses, but the concepts still apply, right? It's all about your positioning with relation to your subject and your foreground and background, and thinking about that continuously. And again, staying present in the moment and really taking things slow and enjoying the moment too. Because I think part of being around wild animals is just enjoying their presence. Helps you get these softer foregrounds and backgrounds.
Absolutely.
Something I've been doing to force that soft foreground, because that can be really tricky sometimes to make the landscape work with that, is I'll actually grab a handful of snow or a leaf, something that kind of matches the color of the backdrop, and hold it up in front of my lens. I know that's a trick that sometimes people who do portrait photography will use, like a light prism, to kind of force the same little effect. So get silly. You might look like a doofus with a handful of snow in your camera lens, and you're like, trying to make it all work. But just play around, see what you can do. Get creative with it. It's cool to see the results.
That's an amazing tip. I'm totally stealing that one.
It's really fun.
Aww.
So this tip talks a lot about the same concepts that Arthur just went over. Subject isolation. Creating softness is one of the best techniques in order to achieve subject isolation. So like I talked about a little bit with the earlier bear photo, wildlife is designed to blend into the backdrop. That's just what they do. Sagebrush is the bane of our existence because ungulates like deer, elk, and moose disappear into sagebrush flawlessly because that's what they were made for. So you have to try to outsmart nature in order to get photos where your subject is properly isolated from the backdrop. And I don't necessarily think that all the time it's the most intuitive thought. So let's pull into the next photos here and talk a little bit more about, this is one of my favorite examples of a moment where I was just so thrilled to see a really charismatic moment with this tiny little bear cub clapping his hands. And I didn't think about the fact that there are two other bears right behind him. It's still an adorable photo, right? You look at it and you say, oh my God, how cute that bear is going like this. I love him. I want to bring him home and be friends with him forever. Nope. But in terms of something, you'd want to like display on your wall or spend a good amount of time looking at, after a while, it's just going to give you a headache because this bear just blends into her mom. And then you get a little bit distracted by the bear to the left.
Sorry, I jumped the gun.
Was an opportunity. No, this is perfect timing. This is an opportunity where I had, again, a mother bear with cubs. And I was really intentional about finding a moment or waiting for a moment and finding a location where I'm not going to have to worry about that baby bear blending into mom. So as this mother bear moved across this hillside, we were down below. Drew Hamilton, once again, shout out to the ever elusive Drew, was with me in this moment. And we kind of kept parallel with this mom and her cub until they kind of like came around this bend and were up against the clear, stormy sky. The ground was like its own little horizon line of goodness, like pointing to the bears. And then things just got really magical when the cub decided to stand up and be so charismatic and photogenic. But it's just a nice little example of how often you'll find your subject, and unfortunately, it's going to have a really busy background, whether it's because there's plants, natural habitat behind them, or if it's an animal like a bear cub that's part of a family unit, or it's a herd animal like an elk and a deer, you're going to have a bajillion other elk or deer in the backdrop or a bunch of other bears in the backdrop. So really be mindful about making sure that you're really waiting for the moment or putting yourself in the position to capture your subject when it's isolated from the backdrop to really have it stand out.
Yeah. And to that point, to add to what Brooke's saying, I think this is an amazing tip and sort of something else to think about when you're getting into wildlife photography or refining your craft in wildlife photography is really focusing on being at the right place. So one of my tips that I've given on other Olympus talks or OM system talks is to follow the light. So this was with regards to photographing wildlife in the forest. Follow the light, right? If the light is better, say inside the forest midday, put yourself in a position where you can succeed should an animal put itself in or act in a way that's ideal to you. I think the image of the wolf that you saw earlier on one of my slides is a great example of that too, because that wolf was nowhere near that log when I had the reflex to change my lens from the 300 f4 prime to the 40 to 150 f2.8. And I saw it and I thought, well, maybe by some random stroke of luck, this wolf will walk up onto the log and pose and it'll be a beautiful photo. So I changed my lens and sure enough, the wolf walks up onto the log and poses and looks back at me. So again, thinking about being in the right place to create that subject isolation, I think is a really important tip. So if you can be in the open and you're expecting an animal to come out into the open, that's already a better place to be than in a busy forest, for example, to capture a subject well isolated from the backdrop.
Absolutely. I really also like the technical term, an official technical term, horizon line of goodness. So
I am a very well-spoken, very rhetorically gifted individual.
I mean, that's going in my next photography book. That is the number one tip, is follow the horizon line of goodness. But I mean, also these tips are really applicable to anything, even for someone who's maybe starting out or learning how to do these sorts of things, or doesn't live in, the middle of nowhere in Wyoming, and they have to utilize things such as like zoos or nature preserves or things like that to capture these images, is just really keeping in mind that all it takes sometimes is moving your body a little bit and finding that nice soft background that takes a picture from being kind of a snapshot to something that you're going to hang in your living room. And these are just really great examples of that.
Yeah, like you said, sometimes literally a couple of steps can make a completely different image. So staying present again. Last one for me, then and now, have some fun, slow your shutter a bit. I think when we all get into wildlife photography, Brooke mentioned a really good tip, which I do stand by, even though it contradicts what I'm about to mention now, of do whatever you have to do to get the shot, which is great. And I agree with that. When you see something and you're excited, you just want to get the shot. And sometimes you just have to let it out and get the shot first, right? But once you get the shot, once you settle into that present moment, once you really start thinking about things and what's happening, not just with your subject, but with your backdrop, with your foreground, isolating your subject, and beyond that, the environment around it, in this case, in this image, the rain. I think we have this instinct as wildlife photographers, as we get into wildlife, to sometimes shoot with a bit too high of a shutter speed, because we just want to get the shot and make sure it's sharp. But sometimes, and I'll be honest, in this case, it wasn't intentional, but sometimes, in this case being this image, sometimes slowing down your shutter a bit can actually lead to some really, really interesting effects. In this case, I was shooting at 1/250th of a second. This bear was walking slowly in the river. And had I been shooting at, say, 1/1000th, the rain, the ever so slight trails in the rain falling from the sky wouldn't have been there. And I have some photos from before when my settings were a little sharper, or faster, I should say. My shutter speed was a little faster. And you can barely even see the rain because they're tiny little droplets. Whereas when you allow your camera to slow down a bit, you get a little bit of that trailing and gives it that feeling of like, wow, it's actively raining. It gives it the mood and the feel that you want in an image. So the next two images, I think, are a great example of that. This is an image I took on my first ever trip to Brooks Falls in Alaska. This was in 2018. This is also the first time I ever used at the time, Olympus camera. A guide friend of mine that I was on the trip with lent it to me. And I was like, wow, I love this. So this is a photo of a bear standing on top of Brooks Falls, waiting for salmon to jump up into its mouth, hopefully, or trying to snag it as it tries to make its way upstream to spawn up in Lake Brooks. Fast forward from 2018 to 2022, 4 years later, and this is the same spot, different photo. But as you can tell, very different approach. And in this case, I was very much focused on slowing things down. This was far slower of a shutter speed, obviously. Probably half a second on this photo, I think it was. So the challenge, of course, with a half a second shutter was to ask the bear very nicely if he can stand still, which took a few tries. Of course, these bears wait patiently, but like all animals, they're moving around, kind of looking around, bobbing their heads. So to get them to sit still for even a half second is a challenge. But nonetheless, slowing down the shutter, really giving a completely different feel, and again, creating softness in an image that otherwise, if you go back to the last one, you can tell very grainy in the water, very sharp, and all that sharpness, all around the sides of the bear in the water really detracts from the focus on the bear. Whereas you go back to the newer one, your eye just instantly zooms right into the bear. Why? Again, creating softness, isolating your subject. And in this case, it's done by slowing your shutter speed. So slowing your shutter speed, once you've got that photo, once you let that out and you get the moment, have some fun, play around with your settings, and see what you can get to create some different effects with your camera. Quick note on ethics. Wanted to drop this because as wildlife photographers, I think ethics should be the guiding mantra to our work, to what we do. As I mentioned earlier, we put the animals first. Wildlife comes first. Our goal as wildlife photographers is to disturb the wildlife and alter their natural behaviors as little as possible. How do you do that? You can educate yourself on specific behaviors for certain species that you're focusing on. You can educate yourself on how those species actually behave in your environment. For example, a bear in Grand Teton National Park, very different than a bear in Alaska. So important to know the differences locally as to animals. And ethics aren't always obvious. I think it's an ever-changing discussion, right? The most obvious thing, as is the case with this image, this is a fox that unfortunately was baited by another photographer further down the line and ended up being put down because it was habituated to food. The most obvious thing in animal ethics is don't bait wildlife. So you should never bait wildlife. But beyond that, there's so many more nuances to the world of ethics around wild animals. I think the most important thing, and Brooke, maybe you can add to this, is to never stop learning. Continue having discussions. When you have an encounter with an animal, let's say you're with friends, talk about it afterwards. What was this animal doing? Did we disturb it? What do you think? I don't know. It's an ever-changing discussion. And lastly, before I let you jump in, Brooke, sorry, focus on educating others. Focus on not shaming others for behavior and instead approaching from a place of support and love and helping others understand what their behaviors are actually doing in a certain situation rather than instantly bashing them.
Arthur nailed it all. I love the saying, educate, don't hate. It's very easy to want to shame people when they quote unquote break the rules, but oftentimes people don't know the rules. Ethics is a spectrum. Always be learning.
Yeah.
Right. And we experienced that when we were in the Tetons as well, and witnessing lots of people that maybe didn't understand, the wildlife comes first situation, and seeing an animal, it's very easy to get excited. I know I'm very guilty of it. I saw my first in the wild bald eagle the other day and I was so jazzed, and I get that, but also respecting when an animal is leaving you or, quickly walking away from you. It doesn't want you to chase it into the woods. So maybe don't get 50 people chasing it into the woods, using common sense to really, it's like body language of humans, right? When you notice somebody is not encouraged by what you're saying, you maybe change your position on that. So, making animals feel comfortable in their surroundings is highly important. And the beautiful thing about having nice long lenses is you can give them space and let them enjoy their lives from afar.
Exactly. So yeah, we talked a little bit about this already when we were mentioning Arthur and I's guide expeditions earlier in the presentation, but just wanted to put a little bit more succinct information right here for that. So part of the reason why Arthur and I have these really incredible wildlife encounters is because we have the luxury of, like Mishalla said, living in the middle of nowhere. And we get to be around these animals day after day. And we get to spend all this time in the field with them, learning individuals' behaviors, learning species behavioral patterns such as migrations, food usage, and things like that. We have a high level of understanding of using wildlife tracking as a means to find and predict what animals are going to be doing. And because of the amount of time we've spent around these animals, we have a really good understanding of body language in terms of keeping ourselves safe as well as keeping the animals comfortable. Our goal when Arthur and I are bear guiding is to leave before our subjects do. So the bears are so unaffected by our presence. They continue fishing happily on the stream, and we leave when it's time, and that bear continues with its life because it felt like we were never there. And we're really privileged in that, right? We understand a lot of people are doing the majority of their wildlife photography in urban areas. They don't get to go spend day after day out with their subjects. So if you are trying to plan a trip where you want to go photograph some of this larger charismatic megafauna, think about hiring a guide, because they do all the footwork for you. They make sure that you're getting to where the cool animals are, making sure that you're being safe, the animals being safe, ethics are being led with number one. So that's a plug to our Think Wild expeditions. By the way, if you do go look at our website right now, everything is sold out, but we have our workshops coming for fall that'll be posted in the next couple weeks here. So just check back periodically. And of course, you don't only have to work with us. There are guide outfitters for wildlife anywhere you can think of. If you guys live in on the East Coast, look at the various national parks or state forests around where you're located. There's a lot of guide services that will take you into those areas specifically looking for wildlife. Look at clubs and things like that. If you're into birding, there's a lot of really cool birding communities and clubs where there's usually like one lead instructor in charge of getting everybody in front of a certain bird and making sure that they're learning about their subject. So just, explore where you live and find out what services are available nearby. The wildlife guiding industry is definitely one that kind of exists under the table. You don't really know much about it until you learn that it exists and how beneficial it can be to start utilizing resources like that.
Absolutely. Same goes with a lot of type of natural photography. When I was in the Tetons, we went with our guide, Matt Seuss, who's also an OM System ambassador, and found locations that had I just gone to photograph the Milky Way on my own, I would have picked a location and it would have been really boring and fine. It probably would have been fine, but he took me to locations I would have never found on my own because that years of experiences that guides, wildlife guides, nature guides, landscape guides have is going to far supersede any of your experience being fresh and new going out there. So it's definitely worth enlisting the help of others because I got spectacular shots that night that I would have never experienced in any other way. So I thoroughly agree. So sorry that I shouted out your stuff and it's all booked up, but everybody bookmark the page so you can bookmark it. Book yourself next year. All right. So I think we're ready for some questions. So my question is, why are you talking to the scat, Art?
So fun story, because this is obviously going to be a question at this point. I think Mickey's in the comments. Mickey's in the comments, who was on this trip with us, may have taken this photo. This was on an expedition Brooke and I led last summer on Admiralty Island, which I talked about a little bit earlier for that brown bear. And this was simply one of the most beautiful piles of bear scats we have ever laid our eyes upon. So we just had to take a selfie with it. I'm not talking to it. I'm really just admiring it.
It was enormous. This is like twice the size of an average brown bear scat. I mean, the bear that laid this down had to have been over 1,000 pounds, 12 feet tall, minimum.
I feel like you just need like a side feed of like scat. Nope, that came out wrong. Like an Instagram channel that's just talking about the various animal poos of the wild.
I've thought about that. My fridge right now, for anyone listening, is full of wolf scat. I'm collecting wolf scat for a couple of little projects that I'm working on, and it's gotten really strange. And I feel weird if I keep it to myself. I feel like I'm doing something wrong, so I have to tell everyone because somehow that makes me feel less strange and bad. But yeah, we really love scat because it teaches you so much about the animals and what they're doing and how cool they are.
That being said, I was pretty close to that scat.
You were very close to it. I mean, you're more close than I would be comfortable being to some scat. So we do have a couple of questions that are already in the comments that I started from earlier that I wanted to circle back to. But if you have any other questions, and Mickey does say that they were there, if you do have any other questions, start adding them to the comment section now because we are going to have to get wrapped up pretty soon because we're past our hour, but that's okay. So first up, the question was, Brooke and Arthur, thanks. Do you use the MC20 and how often would you say you use it? So do you use that in partnership? I know you guys both use the 150 to 400 kind of a lot, but.
Yeah, I used to use it all the time. I used to use it on my 40 to 150 a lot to just make it that much more of an effective zoom lens. In the last few years, since I've gotten the big white lens, I have not used as much, but I love it. And actually, even though I don't use it, it's always in my backpack because it's like this big. So there's no point to not bring it just in case.
Absolutely.
Personally, I do. Actually, that shot of the wolf you guys saw earlier in the bottom left corner with a white backdrop was shot on a 40 to 150 f2.8 with the MC20 adapter. I don't use it as much anymore just because I have the 150 to 400 now. The real reason I was using it back then is because I was shooting with the 40 to 150 and the 300 prime. And so I had some focal lengths that I wasn't quite hitting. And with the wolf, you know, being such a rare encounter, I really needed the zoom to avoid the animal getting too close, which it did end up getting too close, where I wouldn't have been able to capture that moment with the 300. So that adapter is an outstanding option if you're kind of getting into your new gear, your new quiver of lenses, and you want to give yourself that range, but you can't quite yet throw down the money for a longer, more expensive lens. So I love it. I use it all the time, or used to use it all the time. I don't use it quite as much, but still a great piece of gear.
Nice. All right, this one's for Arthur. Arthur, do you ever go to the Colorado Wolf and Wildlife Center down in Divide? Have you ever been?
I haven't been there yet. And I know it's not too far from my house, which is ironic, but I haven't been there yet, although I'm spending a lot more time in Colorado these days in light of the looming reintroduction of wolves, which is going to happen later this year. There's already a few wolves in the state that have somehow made their way down from Wyoming, which is an achievement in and of itself, but more wolves to come. And I do plan on getting more involved with rescues like this one. Another rescue that I will work with over in Los Angeles is the Wolf Connection. They also have a great podcast if anyone's ever into listening to podcasts about wolves. The Wolf Connection, great podcast.
There's a podcast for everything. This isn't really a question so much, but I do think that, you know, especially Brooke being from New Jersey, Art being in Colorado. Miami. Oh, you're from Miami? How did I not know that about you?
I was not born, but I was raised in Miami.
That's wild, because I feel like that is not how I envisioned you at all in my brain compartment of you. So
I've had like 3 different lives.
So this is kind of not really a question, but I do think, you know, addressing kind of wildlife photography in cities, you know, when you happen to be in a city, do you have any tips for, you know, how someone, because not everyone's going to have access to the backwoods of Alaska, you know.
Totally. I love this question. I'm going to roll it into another question that somebody asked about what my recommendations and Arthur's recommendations would be for beginners encountering wildlife subjects and how to find them. So yeah, urban environments and urban encounters, it's challenging. Animals in cities tend to be much more elusive for obvious reasons. There's lots of people. Oftentimes they are a little bit more nocturnal. Wildlife will actually adjust their activity schedules to avoid times when people are most active. But there's a couple of little like life hacks that you can utilize to try to get a better pulse on when and where there are animals in whatever your locality is. So I lived in Salt Lake City for a really long time in downtown Sugar House neighborhood. I wasn't driving around much because I was having a lot of problems with my car. It was stolen, so I didn't have one. And I still wanted to photograph wild animals. So I would spend hours of my day on Facebook looking at various neighborhood Facebook pages. There's just this thing that people love to do when they're active on like neighborhood social media. So neighborhood Facebook pages, or if you've heard of the Nextdoor app, if you live in the United States, it's really popular in urban areas now, especially on the East Coast. And it's an app that's made to just keep neighbors in touch with one another. So like, did anybody lose power tonight? Does anybody have a vacuum I can borrow? Does anybody else hear a strange noise coming from unit 361? And it's really interesting. For some reason, when people see animals in their neighborhood, they love to tell their neighbors. They love to be like, everybody, be careful with your chihuahuas. I saw a coyote yesterday at 6 a.m. while walking my son to the bus stop. Oh my gosh. Or they'll post things like, look at this herd of deer in my backyard. How cute are they? We never get deer this far into the city. How exciting. And perusing those forums is an amazing way to get a pulse on where there's wildlife in an urban area. Anytime I'm traveling, I do that as well. I've got an upcoming trip that'll be taking me through Winnipeg in Manitoba. I won't be there until September, but I'm already on every single neighborhood Facebook page in Winnipeg, getting an idea of how often people see animals within the city center. And I learned that it's actually a hotspot for owls. Nice. There's also apps like eBird, which is hyphen bird. You can use the desktop version, just go to ebird.com, or you can download the app. And it's actually a map where people pin bird sightings. Super useful tool. So, you know, less of the time spent trekking and searching for animals in the forest when you live in the city, but you are doing like digital tracking is what I call it, to try to find wildlife in more urban localities as well.
Yeah, and to elaborate on a few points Brooke just made, I think that once you start narrowing down those areas, a really affordable and useful tool, because wildlife in these areas can be more nocturnal or crepuscular, so active at dawn and at dusk, is to buy a cheap trail camera. Once you start getting familiar with some local areas, let's say there's a big park in your city and there's a few little creeks or drainages, heavily bushed areas, have some fun, stick some trail cameras around, assuming that it's allowed in that area. Some areas don't allow it, so just be aware. And see what comes by. Maybe you'll see a coyote walk by, or all you see is a couple birds landing in front of your camera. But that gives you a pulse into what's happening while you're not there. And you know, they're less than $100. It's pretty easy to get into that, and it's fun because you get to see what's around. When it comes to the city aspect, more so rather than getting into encounters with wildlife subjects, I think that in a city, focus on what you have there and really start getting your technique down with more common subjects. Squirrels are everywhere. Getting your technique down with common subjects is a huge help, because the day that you do run into something special, you want to be prepared. One tip that I borrow from Brooke that she always gives is to how do you word it exactly, Brooke?
I don't know which tip you're about to reference.
I don't know. It's escaping me right now, but basically it's to be ready. What's that?
Nothing is mundane. Photograph anything. Be opportunistic.
It's linked to that, but basically be opportunistic. That's the tip. So really being opportunistic is the heart and soul of wildlife photography. Things can happen very quickly and end even faster. And practicing with those more mundane, so to say, subjects like squirrels will help you be ready, so that the day that you do encounter maybe a coyote just runs across at the park that you're photographing squirrels at, you're going to be ready for that moment and you're going to capture that shot.
Right. I did this in my yard. Like, I have bird feeders set up for all the birds so that I can like practice. And I have a million photos of like scrub jays and little brown birds. They're not super interesting. I love them because now they're my besties and they hang out in my yard all the time. But, you know, it really did help me to get quicker on the fly. It helped me with my custom mode, setting up my custom modes on my camera. So I knew, you know, to get that muscle memory of quickly adjusting my settings and jumping to it. But the other thing too is, even living in a city, branch out a little bit and look at what's around you. I'm really close to a major a state capital actually. And literally 5 miles from my house is a wildlife refuge. It's just an open piece of land that you can wander. And right now the birds are migrating through there and it's phenomenal. There's all kinds of birds out there. And that's right outside the city. So, I mean, I know it's hard and challenging to not be in the deep. You're probably not going to find a grizzly bear there. To be honest, that's not going to happen, but, you know,
hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. But there's lots of opportunities for you to really kind of explore in your local area. So looking for, you know, those safe areas to, you know, carefully find wildlife and practice on more mundane subjects. But you know what? I've got 100 pictures of scrub jays and I still like to photograph them. So I think it's
never
perfect.
Stop shooting.
Yes.
Never stop shooting.
Gary Kelly wants to know which camera bodies you guys generally shoot with primarily.
Yeah, we both shoot them all. I've had them all, and I use them all. It's really crazy. Sometimes I'll pick up a camera. Like, I still shoot on my EM1 Mark II sometimes. I don't know. Sometimes just like for nostalgia sake. But yeah, primarily the OM1. Funny enough, Arthur and I have our own special name for the OM1 because when it first came out, I was really excited and texted Arthur like, the camera is out, but I spelled it wrong. I said an N instead of an M, so we call it the camera. But yeah, we are obsessed with the OM1. I'm learning about birds a lot, and I am obsessed with the AI autofocus on the OM1. It's totally one of those little features that I've never had before, and now that I have it, I cannot live without it. So super in love with the OM1. I still use my EM1 Mark III kind of as like my secondary camera. So I'll have my big white lens on the OM1, and then I'll have like my 40 to 150 on my Mark III, and you know, be ready so I don't have to switch lenses, because if you let me switch lenses, I will drop them.
Yeah. I also use the OM1. I haven't used every camera like Brooke has, but I've used a lot of them. I started on an EM5 Mark II, nice. Then an EM5 Mark III, then an EM1 Mark 3, and then the OM1. Once you get used to some of these features, it's hard to go back. So fair warning, they are amazing features. The AI tracking is really life-changing. But one of the things I really love about the OM1 is the new sensor. The way that it handles noise is
insane,
much better, especially if you're shooting using more proper techniques and you're exposing your image properly with your histogram a little bit further to the right so you can capture more of the data. With the denoise softwares that we have nowadays, like Topaz Denoise, I have images that I've posted that are ISO 4000 where after running it through denoise, you can't even notice anything. So I love the new sensors on the OM1. Really just gorgeous images. Totally in love with that camera. It's hard to put it down, honestly. I struggle to go back to some of my older cameras, even though I like to play around.
I'm kind of in the same boat. I love my OM1 so much, and I've gotten so reliant on, my bird photography. My hits are so much better now with the bird AI.
Yeah.
Autofocus. I'm like, oh my gosh, look, I got doves in flight fighting the other day. I was like, it's never got that on my EM1 Mark III because I'm just too slow and not talented.
It's so funny. Like, even going back to the EM1 III, I'll be shooting something and I'm like, oh wait, I have to focus on the animals.
I have to think about this again.
It really does open up a lot of creative opportunities, though, when it comes to a lot of the tips that we just gave to being more present in the moment, right? It just removes one more thing for you to think about to set you free creatively, so to say. So for that, I think it's also been hugely beneficial just because I have one less thing to think about. Totally. You already have a lot of things you're thinking about when you're spending time around wild animals.
Right. And the opportunity to photograph them is so finite. It's such a short amount of time, potentially, because that animal could be spooked or decide they don't want to be there anymore. So having all those tools at your hands, like, again, I'm a convert to custom modes and I love my custom modes now, but having those tools at hand to be able to quickly get the shot without having to spend as much time thinking about it. You're right, Art, is just, it's worth its weight in gold because you spend less time worrying and more time absolutely getting the photograph you were there to get.
Totally.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am going to let you guys have the rest of your day back because we're super over time. And I cannot believe all of you guys are still here watching. The comment section is still going and you guys are so great. And so many of you helping each other answer questions in the comments as we go along or discussing lens recommendations. As always, this community of photographers with OM System and Olympus users is phenomenal. And you guys are so helpful to each other. And we just really, really appreciate you guys all hanging out with us tonight. And Brooke and Art, I appreciate you both hanging out with me and sharing so much information.
Thank you. This was awesome. Everyone who's hanging out, if you have more questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Arthur and I. We're very nice for the most part. And we'd love to answer questions. So shoot us messages on Instagram if you're on there. I'm Brooke Little Bear. He's Arthur Lefo. Thank you all for tuning in. Happy World Wildlife Day.
Happy World Wildlife Day.
Happy World Wildlife Day. And thank you to our team in marketing who was answering questions in the chat. We appreciate you so much. You make these things go so much smoother. And we will see you guys all next time. Bye.
Bye, guys.